By 2026, the United States is projected to reach a nominal GDP of $32.38 trillion, generating more than a quarter of the entire world's economic output. It operates as a highly optimized wealth machine, moving goods and capital with relentless velocity. But right on the physical borders of that wealth generation sits a starkly different reality. Nearly 36 million Americans currently live below the poverty line, attempting to survive a nationwide housing affordability crisis while completely disconnected from the prosperity above them. This divergence became exceptionally clear in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic. Since 2019, U.S. economic output per hour spiked by nearly 7%, absolutely eclipsing the Eurozone's 1% crawl. Yet that domestic hypergrowth arrived alongside 40-year high inflation that crushed the purchasing power of the American working class. How does a single nation engineer a mechanism capable of generating this much global wealth while simultaneously racking up $34.4 trillion in debt and producing some of the sharpest wealth inequality in the developed world? These trends point toward an economic architecture that prioritizes aggregate growth, even when that prosperity stops short of the individual household. The foundational advantage of this output machine starts with geography. The United States began its rapid expansion on a massive, resource-dense continent, buffered by two vast oceans that isolated it from centuries of constant European warfare. Without the threat of rival empires marching across its borders every few decades, the country had a highly stable runway to build. By the late 19th century, that uninterrupted period of industrialization transformed the U.S. into a factory powerhouse, churning out unprecedented volumes of steel and manufactured goods. Entering the 20th century, that physical isolation compounded into a massive geopolitical advantage. Two world wars completely decimated the physical infrastructure of Europe, while the American mainland remained entirely untouched. Instead of rebuilding bombed-out rail networks and leveled cities, the U.S. mobilized its domestic workforce to an extreme degree. At the peak of World War II, nearly 40% of the entire American gross domestic product was dedicated exclusively to war production. The macroeconomic numbers from that pivot are staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the U.S. economy nearly doubled in size. In contrast, heavily bombarded rival powers like Japan saw their economic output slashed in half. The conclusion of the war secured a global production monopoly, as the industrial centers of rival powers lay in ruins, while American factories reached peak efficiency. With its economic supremacy secured, the U.S. moved to institutionalize its power. In 1944, Allied delegates gathered at the Bretton Woods Conference and agreed to tie the international monetary system directly to the U.S. currency. This data visualization of global trade flows shows exactly how that advantage plays out today, with roughly 60% of all international trade funds funneling directly through the U.S. dollar. Controlling the global reserve currency allows the United States to borrow money at uniquely low interest rates and dictate the terms of global finance. We saw this unique financial leverage deployed aggressively during the post-COVID recovery. European nations implemented cautious corporate furlough programs to keep workers tied to their jobs. The U.S., meanwhile, injected massive direct financial stimulus into the market. The result is a nearly 7% spike in U.S. output per hour, compared to the Eurozone's flat 1% crawl. That massive recovery speed relies on a uniquely American structural formula: a highly flexible labor market, an incredibly innovative tech sector, and a domestic consumer base that accounts for roughly 70% of the entire economy. The American economy outpaces the rest of the world because it is uniquely designed to violently and rapidly restructure itself during crises. It is a system that deliberately prioritizes macroeconomic agility over the stability of individual workers. That structural agility comes at a steep human cost. A flexible labor market means employers face very little friction when hiring or firing. That efficiency allows companies to adapt instantly, but it strips everyday workers of long-term job security and negotiating leverage. Without that leverage, the spoils of the American output machine rarely distribute downward. Despite massive, sustained increases in national productivity, real wages for the working class have remained largely stagnant for decades. When the U.S. pumped historic amounts of fiscal stimulus into the economy to survive the pandemic, The resulting 40-year high inflation effectively wiped out any modest wage gains lower-income households had managed to secure. This chart tracks the American wealth effect. On the top half, top-tier household net worth explodes past $100 trillion, driven by surging stock valuations. On the bottom, middle-class purchasing power and homeownership flatline, priced out of the housing market by the same boom. America's extreme income inequality is not an accident or a systemic error. It is the necessary structural fuel required to keep this specific economic model running at maximum global velocity. Funding this massive bifurcated system, maintaining global financial dominance abroad while repeatedly bailing out the domestic economy during crises, requires an exorbitant amount of capital. To pay for it all, the federal government has pushed the national debt past $34.4 trillion, breaching a staggering 120% debt-to-GDP ratio. This is the central paradox of the modern United States. The system operates flawlessly to produce staggering innovation, massive industrial scale, and global dominance, yet it structurally fails to distribute the resulting prosperity to the people living inside the machine. The U.S. has perfected the generation of global wealth, but its future now hinges on whether a society optimized for output can endure the internal fractures growing at its foundation.